Mr. Coons, Mr. Cornyn, Ms. Cortez Masto, Mr. Cotton, Mr. Kramer, Mr. Crapo, Mr. Cruz, Mr. Daines, Ms. Duckworth, Mr. Durbin, Ms. Ernst, Mr. Fetterman, Mrs. Fisher, Mrs. Gillibrand, Mr. Graham, Mr. Grassley, Mr. Haggerty, Ms. Hassan, Mr. Hawley, Mr. Heinrich, Mr. Hickenlooper, Ms. Hirono, Mr. Hoven, Mrs. Hyde-Smith, Mr. Johnson, Mr. Kane, Mr. Kelly, Mr. Kennedy, Mr. King, Ms. Klobuchar, Mr. Lankford, Mr. Lee, Mr. Lujan, Ms. Lummis, Mr. Manchin, Mr. Markey, Mr. Marshall, Mr. McConnell, Mr. Menendez, Mr. Merkley, Mr. Moran, Mr. Mullen, Ms. Murkowski, Mr. Murphy, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Ossoff, Mr. Padilla, Mr. Paul, Mr. Peters, Mr. Reed, Mr. Ricketts, Mr. Risch, Mr. Romney, Ms. Rosen, Mr. Rounds, Mr. Rubio, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schmidt, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott of Florida, Mr. Scott of South Carolina, Mrs. Shaheen, Ms. Sinema, Ms. Smith, Ms. Stabenow, Mr. Sullivan, Mr. Tester, Mr. Thune, Mr. Tillis, Mr. Tuberville, Mr. Van Hollen, Mr. Vance, Mr. Warner, Mr. Warnock, Ms. Warren, Mr. Welch, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden, Mr. Young,
No, the motion to table is agreed to.
Thank you. Motion to table is agreed to.
On this vote, the yeas are 51, the nays are 47. The motion to table is agreed to.
Mr. President.
The senator from Missouri.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move to concur in the House amendment to Senate amendment to H.R. 2882 with further amendment number 1795.
Clerk will report.
Senator from Missouri, Mr. Schmidt, moves to concur in the House amendment to the Senate amendment to H.R. 2882 with further amendment numbered 1795.
Thank you, Mr.
You
President.
have 2
Jefferson-
minutes on this motion, equally divided. The senator from Missouri.
Thank you, Mr. President. Jefferson Smith is a newly minted senator, and Frank Capra's Mr. Smith Goes to Washington opined, liberty is too precious a thing to be buried in books. Men should hold it in front of them every single day of their lives and say, I am free to think and to speak. My ancestors couldn't, I can, and my children will. My amendment tackles a fundamental issue that should bring us together as a Senate, protecting Americans' First Amendment rights in the virtual town square. The First Amendment is the beating heart of our Constitution. It protects fundamental human expression. The government shouldn't be deciding what we can read or what we can hear
Please, order in the Senate. Will
or what we can
senator from
say.
Missouri.
Earlier this week, Murphy versus Missouri was heard in the United States Supreme Court. I filed that case when I was Attorney General in Missouri. At issue in that case is what is at the heart of the issue here, this amendment, which is pretty simple. Should the federal government and its leviathan of agencies be allowed to coerce and collude with social media companies to censor speech online? The answer for every American should be a resounding no. Unfortunately, that's what top officials in the Biden administration were doing, and why this amendment is so important. What's more, censorship isn't limited to just conservative-leaning speech. It
Senator's
affects
time
everyone.
has expired.
All ideologies. This should bring us together. This would protect Americans' free speech. I urge this body to support it.
The senator from Illinois.
Mr. President, at a moment in our history when we're giving speeches about our concern of the impact of disinformation and misinformation on America, this is exactly the wrong amendment. We know the Russians, the Chinese, and God knows who else are using information and twisting information and delivering it to our neighbors as a truth. And how are they supposed to know any better? This amendment will basically remove the authority of the United States government to speak up about misinformation and disinformation. If you want our citizenry to be more vulnerable, vote yes for this amendment. If you want to make sure we're doing everything in our power to stop Vladimir Putin and others from infiltrating America, vote no on this amendment.
Questions on the motion? Yeas and nays have been requested. Is there a sufficient second? There appears to be. There is. The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Baldwin. Mr. Barrasso. Mr. Bennett. Mrs. Blackburn. Mr. Blumenthal. Mr. Booker. Mr. Bozeman. Mr. Braun. Mrs. Britt. Mr. Brown. Mr. Budd. Ms. Butler. Ms. Cantwell. Mrs. Capito. Mr. Cardin. Mr. Carper. Mr. Casey. Mr. Cassidy. Ms. Collins. Mr. Coons. Mr. Cornyn. Ms. Cortez Masto. Mr. Cotton. Mr. Kramer. Mr. Crapo. Mr. Cruz. Mr. Daines. Ms. Duckworth. Mr. Durbin. Ms. Ernst. Mr. Fetterman. Mrs. Fisher. Mrs. Gillibrand. Mr. Graham. Mr. Grassley. Mr. Haggerty. Ms. Hassan. Mr. Hawley. Mr. Heinrich. Mr. Hickenlooper. Ms. Arono. Mr. Hoven. Mrs. Hyde-Smith. Mr. Johnson. Mr. Kane. Mr. Kelly. Mr. Kennedy. Mr. King. Ms. Klobuchar. Mr. Langford. Mr. Lee. Mr. Lujan. Ms. Lummis. Mr. Manchin. Mr. Markey. Mr. Marshall. Mr. McConnell. Mr. Menendez. Mr. Merkley. Mr. Moran. Mr. Mullen. Ms. Murkowski. Mr. Murphy. Mrs. Murray. Mr. Ossoff. Mr. Padilla. Mr. Paul. Mr. Peters. Mr. Reed. Mr. Ricketts. Mr. Risch. Mr. Romney. Ms. Rosen. Mr. Rounds. Mr. Rubio. Mr. Sanders. Mr. Schatz. Mr. Schmidt. Mr. Schumer. Mr. Scott of Florida. Mr. Scott of South Carolina. Mrs. Shaheen. Ms. Sinema. Ms. Smith. Ms. Stabenow. Mr. Sullivan. Mr. Tester. Mr. Thune. Mr. Tillis. Mr. Tuberville. Mr. Van Hollen. Mr. Vance. Mr. Warner. Mr. Warnock. Ms. Warren. Mr. Welch. Mr. Whitehouse. Mr. Wicker. Mr. Wyden. Mr. Young.
On this vote, the yeas are 47, the nays are 51. The motion is not agreed to. The senator from Wisconsin.
I move to concur in the House amendment to the Senate amendment to H.R. 2882 with further amendment number 1706.
Clerk will report.
The senator from Wisconsin, Mr. Johnson, moves to concur in the House amendment to the Senate amendment to H.R. 2882 with further amendment numbered 1706.
The Senate will be in order. There are 2 minutes equally divided. The senator from Wisconsin.
Mr. President, in the last 4 months, we've seen a string of horrific crimes in which the suspects are illegal immigrants. In December, a 16-year-old cheerleader was stabbed to death in Edna, Texas.
Order in the Senate.
In my state, a 20-year-old nurse was run down by a drunk driver. In January, again in my state, a Special Olympian was struck by a drunk driver. In Campbell County, Virginia, a 14-year-old girl was sexually assaulted. In January, a 2-year-old was caught in the crossfire of gangs and murdered. In Kenner, Louisiana, a 14-year-old girl was raped by another individual and was stabbed by an illegal suspect. On February 22nd, Laken Riley was beaten to death while jogging in Athens, Georgia. And just last week, a 15-year-old mentally impaired girl was raped in Massachusetts. Mr. President, this must stop. My amendment is simple. It prohibits labor, HHS, and education funding from going to sanctuary cities that do not comply with the requests from DHS to provide advance notice of date and time illegal aliens are scheduled to be released from local custody. We can stop these crimes. We must secure our border. Please vote yes.
President.
Senator from Connecticut.
Mr. President, this is a perfect example of an amendment that does not deserve to be debated without real work and real bipartisan commitment. This is a legitimate issue, making sure that we have notice when you have an individual in state or local custody. But this version of the amendment doesn't work. It likely violates the 10th Amendment. It likely violates the 4th Amendment. It fundamentally misunderstands the statute it implicates, 8 U.S.C. 1373. There is a better way to do this in a bipartisan manner. In fact, a number of us just recently introduced legislation that would allow ICE to obtain a legal warrant when you have an individual in state or local custody to make sure that they end up being put into removal proceedings. So let's continue to work on this very important issue. This is just the wrong way to do it, likely deeply unconstitutional. And for that reason, I would move to table the motion to concur with the Johnson Amendment number 1706, and I would ask for the yeas and nays.
Is there sufficient second? There appears to be. There is. The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Baldwin, Mr. Barrasso, Mr. Bennett, Mrs. Blackburn, Mr. Blumenthal, Mr. Booker, Mr. Bozeman, Mr. Braun, Mrs. Britt, Mr. Brown, Mr. Budd, Ms. Butler, Ms. Cantwell, Mrs. Capito, Mr. Cardin, Mr. Carper, Mr. Casey, Mr. Cassidy, Ms. Collins, Mr. Coons, Mr. Cornyn, Ms. Cortez Masto, Mr. Cotton, Mr. Kramer, Mr. Crapo, Mr. Cruz, Mr. Daines, Ms. Duckworth, Mr. Durbin, Ms. Ernst, Mr. Fetterman, Mrs. Fisher, Mrs. Gillibrand, Mr. Graham, Mr. Grassley, Mr. Haggerty, Ms. Hassan, Mr. Hawley, Mr. Heinrich, Mr. Hickenlooper, Ms. Hirono, Mr. Hoven, Mrs. Hyde-Smith, Mr. Johnson, Mr. Kane, Mr. Kelly, Mr. Kennedy, Mr. King, Ms. Klobuchar, Mr. Langford, Mr. Lee, Mr. Lujan, Ms. Lummis, Mr. Manchin, Mr. Markey, Mr. Marshall, Mr. McConnell, Mr. Menendez, Mr. Merkley, Mr. Moran, Mr. Mullen, Ms. Murkowski, Mr. Murphy, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Ossoff, Mr. Padilla, Mr. Paul, Mr. Peters, Mr. Reed, Mr. Ricketts, Mr. Risch, Mr. Romney, Ms. Rosen, Mr. Rounds, Mr. Rubio, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schmidt, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott of Florida, Mr. Scott of South Carolina, Mrs. Shaheen, Ms. Sinema, Ms. Smith, Ms. Stabenow, Mr. Sullivan, Mr. Tester, Mr. Thune, Mr. Tillis, Mr. Tuberville, Mr. Van Hollen, Mr. Vance, Mr. Warner, Mr. Warnock, Ms. Warren, Mr. Welch, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden, Mr. Young,
On this vote, the yeas are 51, the nays are 47. The motion to table is agreed to.
Mr. President,
Senator from Oklahoma.
I move to concur in the House amendment to the Senate amendment to H.R. 2882 with further amendment 1713.
Clerk will report.
Senator from Oklahoma, Mr. Langford moves to concur in the House amendment to the Senate amendment to H.R. 2882 with further amendment numbered 1713.
We have 2 minutes of debate, equally divided. The senator from Oklahoma.
Thank you, Mr. President, I rise today to ask my colleagues to support my amendment that would strike earmark funding for a hospital that performs chemical and surgical abortions, including well into the 5th month of pregnancy. In fact, this hospital, on their website, they brag that they routinely provide abortions up to 22 weeks. 5.5 months into a pregnancy is a late-term abortion. This is beyond even the Roe standard of viability. At 22 weeks, that's 5.5 months. A baby at that point can certainly feel pain. A baby can smile. They have formed tear ducts. They can recognize their mom's voice. They're sensitive to loud voices. They even have their taste buds already formed at that point. Portugal restricts abortions after 10 weeks. Austria, Denmark, Germany, Greece, Hungary, Ireland, Italy, Norway, Switzerland, and the Ukraine all restrict abortion after 12 weeks. Belgium, Luxembourg, Spain restrict after 14. This is a hospital bragging they do abortions at 22 weeks. We may disagree on when life begins, but we should not provide federal dollars for a facility that advertises it performs late-term abortions routinely. We should strike this earmark.
Mr. President,
Senator from Rhode Island.
Mr. President, this amendment would strike funding to help Women and Infants Hospital in Providence, Rhode Island, build a new midwifery unit in order to help ensure babies can safely enter the world and that their moms can have a safe and positive childbirth experience. Some GOP members are insinuating that this is about abortion. No funds will be used for abortions. In fact, these funds will truly have a clear and direct benefit for Rhode Island babies and moms, and I would urge the defeat of the amendment. I yield my time to Senator Whitehouse.
Mr. President, the actual text of the application for this earmark says that it's to develop a nationally accredited in-hospital birth center, a midwifery unit, to provide healthy birthing individuals the choice to give birth in protected, dedicated space for normal physiologic birth, reduce the risks and costs of instrumental births and surgical delivery, and reduce hospital length of stay, thereby reducing healthcare costs. Also, training midwives. It's one thing to be anti-abortion.
The senator's
it's
time
another
has
to be
expired.
anti-IVF or anti-mifepristone.
The senator's time has expired.
I urge that we oppose the senator's amendment.
The question is on the motion. All those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. The noes have it. The motion is not agreed to. Who seeks recognition? Senator from Oklahoma.
Amendment to the Senate amendment to H.R. 2882 with further amendment 1718.
Clerk will report.
Senator from Oklahoma, Mr. Langford, moves to concur in the House amendment to the Senate amendment to HR 2822 with further amendment numbered 1718.
We have 2 minutes of debate equally divided. The senator from Oklahoma.
Mr. President, yesterday, 5,770 people illegally crossed our southern border. Some of them were identified as special interest aliens. Now, let me give you the definition for special interest aliens from the Department of Homeland Security. This is a non-U.S. person who, based on analysis of travel patterns, potentially poses a national security risk to the United States or its interests. Often such individuals or groups are employing travel patterns known or evaluated to possibly have a nexus to terrorism. That's what these individuals are. They have been identified by this administration's DHS as a potential national security risk and a possible nexus to terrorism. The problem is most of them are released into the United States after a very quick screening at the border. Those individuals that have been labeled a national security risk are not being detained at our border. This amendment would simply say, if an individual has been identified by this administration as a national security risk, they have to be detained
Senator's time has expired.
throughout the time that they're evaluated until they're adjudicated. I would ask for a yes vote.
Senator from Connecticut.
Thank you, Mr. President. It has been deeply uncomfortable to be in such regular agreement with Senator Langford on immigration policy, and so it feels good to be back disagreeing with him. This amendment is a bad idea for 3 reasons. One, it shuts down the government if it passes. Second, it is overly broad. What this really amounts to is a ban on individuals from certain countries that tend to be Muslim countries, coming to the United States. But third and most important, it's unnecessary. It's duplicative. The Department of Homeland Security already has the power to deny entry to the country to anyone who is a public safety threat or a national security concern. And so for those 3 reasons, I would urge my colleagues to oppose the bill.
Question is on the motion. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. The noes have it. The noes appear to have it. The noes do have it. The motion is not agreed to.
Mr. President. Angus.
Senator from Mississippi.
No.
Oh, Tennessee, sorry. Senator from Tennessee.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move to refer the message to accompany HR 2882 to the Committee on Judiciary with instructions.
Clerk will report.
The senator from Tennessee, Mrs. Blackburn, moves to refer the message with respect to HR 2882 to the Committee on the Judiciary of the Senate with instructions to report the same back to the Senate in 1 day, not counting any day on which the Senate is not in session, with an amendment consisting of the text of S 3881 as introduced in the Senate on March 6, 2024.
There are 2 minutes of debate equally divided. The senator from Tennessee.
Thank you, Mr. President. Let me tell you what my colleagues are going to vote no to when we voice vote this in a few minutes. This is a concept that has been around for a while, and it is in legislation called the CLEAR Act. What this would simply do is say that our local and state law enforcement, when they apprehend a criminal illegal alien in this country, that they can detain that individual and require ICE to, within 48 hours, come to them to deport that individual. They also would be required to reimburse that entity for the expenses, and then they would also prohibit funds going to cities that do not comply with federal immigration law. The fact that we have Americans losing their lives, Pierce Corcoran from Tennessee, Laken Riley, that we have all
The senator's
talked about,
time has expired.
because of criminal illegal aliens,
The senator's time
is
has
the
expired.
reason to vote yes.
Senator from Washington.
Mr. President, this motion would impose exactly the sort of poison pill rider we all worked very hard to keep out of this important bipartisan package. And it is worth stating once more, there was a bipartisan proposal on border policy changes just a few weeks ago. Republicans walked away from that issue just as soon as Donald Trump told them to. And now here we are tonight facing a serious, prolonged shutdown. Some are pressing for measures like this, even when they know full well they are putting forward partisan policies we worked very hard to keep out of this bill, and there's no way to support this motion now without forcing a pointless government shutdown. None. If Republicans want to show that they are serious, they can work with us on comprehensive immigration reform and real solutions to the challenges we are facing at the border. I urge my colleagues to oppose this motion.
Questions on the motion? All those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed, no.
No.
The noes appear to have it. The noes do have it. The motion is not agreed to. The senator from North Carolina.
Mr. President, I move to table Senate Amendment 1794 for the purpose of offering my amendment number 1807. I would like for 2 minutes of debate.
There are 2 minutes of debate, equally divided. The senator from North Carolina.
Mr. President, thank you. We are in the middle of the worst border crisis in American history as a direct result of the failed policies of President Biden. My amendments are meant to address these failed policies. The amendment I'm offering prevents illegal aliens who commit the crime of assaulting a law enforcement officer from ever obtaining legal status or citizenship. This is particularly relevant to my home state of North Carolina in light of the murder of Wake County Deputy Sheriff Ned Byrd by an illegal alien in 2022. Any senator who claims to support the police should have no problem supporting this amendment. So before you shut down this amendment, just ask yourself, do you believe that someone who beats up a cop and is here illegally should be allowed to legally remain in our country? I don't think so, and I hope that all of my colleagues would agree.
Mr. President,
Senator from Washington.
we have a bipartisan, bicameral package of funding bills before us. And right now, our job is to get them passed as soon as possible. We cannot delay a moment further, and that's what this motion would do. Needlessly drag this out even longer and for absolutely no good reason at all. It is already well past midnight. Let us finish this job, pass our bills. I urge my colleagues to vote no.
Yeas and nays have been requested. Is there sufficient second? There appears to be. There is sufficient second. The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Baldwin. Mr. Barrasso. Mr. Bennett. Mrs. Blackburn. Mr. Blumenthal. Mr. Booker. Mr. Bozeman. Mr. Braun. Mrs. Britt. Mr. Brown. Mr. Budd. Ms. Butler. Ms. Cantwell. Mrs. Capito. Mr. Cardin. Mr. Carper. Mr. Casey. Mr. Cassidy. Ms. Collins. Mr. Coons. Mr. Cornyn. Ms. Cortez Masto. Mr. Cotton. Mr. Kramer. Mr. Crapo. Mr. Cruz. Mr. Daines. Ms. Duckworth. Mr. Durbin. Ms. Ernst. Mr. Fetterman. Mrs. Fisher. Mrs. Gillibrand. Mr. Graham. Mr. Grassley. Mr. Haggerty. Ms. Hassan. Mr. Hawley. Mr. Heinrich. Mr. Hickenlooper. Mr. Rono. Mr. Hoven. Mrs. Hyde-Smith. Mr. Johnson. Mr. Kane. Mr. Kelly. Mr. Kennedy. Mr. King. Ms. Klobuchar. Mr. Langford. Mr. Lee. Mr. Lujan. Ms. Lummis. Mr. Manchin. Mr. Markey. Mr. Marshall. Mr. McConnell. Mr. Menendez. Mr. Merkley. Mr. Moran. Mr. Mullen. Ms. Murkowski. Mr. Murphy. Mrs. Murray. Mr. Ossoff. Mr. Padilla. Mr. Paul. Mr. Peters. Mr. Reed. Mr. Ricketts. Mr. Risch. Mr. Romney. Ms. Rosen. Mr. Rounds. Mr. Rubio. Mr. Sanders. Mr. Schatz. Mr. Schmidt. Mr. Schumer. Mr. Scott of Florida. Mr. Scott of South Carolina. Mrs. Shaheen. Ms. Sinema. Ms. Smith. Ms. Stabenow. Mr. Sullivan. Mr. Tester. Mr. Thune. Mr. Tillis. Mr. Tuberville. Mr. Van Hollen. Mr. Vance. Mr. Warner. Mr. Warnock. Ms. Warren. Mr. Welch. Mr. Whitehouse. Mr. Wicker. Mr. Wyden. Mr. Young.
On this vote, the yeas are 47, the nays are 51. The motion is not agreed to. Senator from Tennessee.
Mr. President, thank you. In order to consider my very simple and reasonable amendment, it's vital that the Senate must move the Democrat leader's blocking amendment out of the way in order to move forward with my amendment. Let me cut through the procedural language here. I'm bringing forward a vote on a very simple question. Do you support American taxpayer dollars being used to fly illegal immigrants from countries like Venezuela and Haiti into America to be settled in cities and towns near you? If so, then vote against me. Vote no to preserve this practice of using taxpayer dollars to charter planes that move and import thousands of illegal aliens into your states. Make no mistake here, President Biden has been secretly flying hundreds of thousands of illegal aliens from foreign countries into Blue City airports. Just last year alone, in 2023, it was reported that some 320,000 illegal aliens have been flown in using this method. Americans are
Senator's
shocked.
time has expired. Does the senator have a motion?
Yes. I move to table.
Mr. President,
Senator from Washington.
exactly like the previous vote, This is a procedural vote that will cause a shutdown. I urge a no vote.
Mr. President, I
Senator
move
from
to table,
Tennessee.
I move to table Senate Amendment 1793 for the purpose of offering my amendment 1808. I'd like to ask for the ayes and nays.
Is there a sufficient second? There appears to be. There is. The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Baldwin. Mr. Barrasso. Mr. Bennett. Mrs. Blackburn. Mr. Blumenthal. Mr. Booker. Mr. Bozeman. Mr. Braun. Mrs. Britt. Mr. Brown. Mr. Budd. Ms. Butler. Ms. Cantwell. Mrs. Capito. Mr. Cardin. Mr. Carper. Mr. Casey. Mr. Cassidy. Ms. Collins. Mr. Coons. Mr. Cornyn. Ms. Cortez Masto. Mr. Cotton. Mr. Kramer. Mr. Crapo. Mr. Cruz. Mr. Daines. Ms. Duckworth. Mr. Durbin. Ms. Ernst. Mr. Fetterman. Mrs. Fisher. Mrs. Gillibrand. Mr. Graham. Mr. Grassley. Mr. Haggerty. Ms. Hassan. Mr. Hawley. Mr. Heinrich. Mr. Hickenlooper. Ms. Hirono. Mr. Hoven. Mrs. Hyde-Smith. Mr. Johnson. Mr. Kane. Mr. Kelly. Mr. Kennedy. Mr. King. Ms. Klobuchar. Mr. Langford. Mr. Lee. Mr. Lujan. Ms. Lummis. Mr. Manchin. Mr. Markey. Mr. Marshall. Mr. McConnell. Mr. Menendez. Mr. Merkley. Mr. Moran. Mr. Mullen. Ms. Murkowski. Mr. Murphy. Mrs. Murray. Mr. Ossoff. Mr. Padilla. Mr. Paul. Mr. Peters. Mr. Reed. Mr. Ricketts. Mr. Risch. Mr. Romney. Ms. Rosen. Mr. Rounds. Mr. Rubio. Mr. Sanders. Mr. Schatz. Mr. Schmidt. Mr. Schumer. Mr. Scott of Florida, Mr. Scott of South Carolina. Mrs. Shaheen. Ms. Sinema. Ms. Smith. Ms. Stabenow. Mr. Sullivan. Mr. Tester. Mr. Thune. Mr. Tillis. Mr. Tuberville. Mr. Van Hollen. Mr. Vance. Mr. Warner. Mr. Warnock. Ms. Warren. Mr. Welch. Mr. Whitehouse. Mr. Wicker. Mr. Wyden. Mr. Young.
On this vote, the yeas are 47, the nays are 51. The motion is not agreed to. The senator from North Carolina.
Thank you, Mr. President. Let me be clear. The amendment I am offering prevents illegal aliens who commit the crime of burglary, theft, or shoplifting from being granted legal status or citizenship. This is particularly relevant in the case of Laken Riley, where the illegal alien who murdered her had previously been arrested for those crimes. The American people need to know who stands on the side of preventing tragedies and who will enable them. Now, I know my Democrat colleagues are fearful, perhaps squeamish, to prevent immigration issues from being voted on tonight. We've even gone into past midnight and into a brief government shutdown to avoid it. So I might be a freshman in this chamber, but I've been here long enough to know that deadlines are powerful motivators, but so should common sense and common decency. Look, we've seen the cost of not dealing with this issue in the tragic death of Laken Riley, and I hope each and every one of my colleagues would agree that it's time to act and to support my amendment.
Senator from Washington.
Just like the previous two votes, this is a procedural vote that will cause a shutdown. I urge a no vote.
Senator from North Carolina.
I move to table Senate Amendment 1792 for the purpose of offering my amendment number 1740. And I ask for the yeas and nays.
Is there a sufficient second? There appears to be. There is a sufficient second. The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Baldwin. Mr. Barrasso. Mr. Bennett. Mrs. Blackburn. Mr. Blumenthal. Mr. Booker. Mr. Bozeman. Mr. Braun. Mrs. Britt. Mr. Brown. Mr. Budd. Ms. Butler. Ms. Cantwell. Mrs. Capito. Mr. Cardin. Mr. Carper. Mr. Casey. Mr. Cassidy. Ms. Collins. Mr. Coons. Mr. Cornyn. Ms. Cortez Masto. Mr. Cotton. Mr. Kramer. Mr. Crapo. Mr. Cruz. Mr. Daines. Ms. Duckworth. Mr. Durbin. Ms. Ernst. Mr. Fetterman. Mrs. Fisher. Mrs. Gillibrand. Mr. Graham. Mr. Grassley. Mr. Haggerty. Ms. Hassan. Mr. Hawley. Mr. Heinrich. Mr. Hickenlooper. Ms. Hirono. Mr. Hoven. Mrs. Hyde-Smith. Mr. Johnson. Mr. Kane. Mr. Kelly. Mr. Kennedy. Mr. King. Ms. Klobuchar. Mr. Langford. Mr. Lee. Mr. Lujan. Ms. Lummis. Mr. Manchin. Mr. Markey. Mr. Marshall. Mr. McConnell. Mr. Menendez. Mr. Merkley. Mr. Moran. Mr. Mullen. Ms. Murkowski. Mr. Murphy. Mrs. Murray. Mr. Ossoff. Mr. Padilla. Mr. Paul. Mr. Peters. Mr. Reed. Mr. Ricketts. Mr. Risch. Mr. Romney. Ms. Rosen. Mr. Rounds. Mr. Rubio. Mr. Sanders. Mr. Schatz. Mr. Schmidt. Mr. Schumer. Mr. Scott of Florida. Mr. Scott of South Carolina. Mrs. Shaheen. Ms. Sinema. Ms. Smith. Ms. Stabenow. Mr. Sullivan. Mr. Tester. Mr. Thune, Mr. Tillis, Mr. Tuberville, Mr. Van Hollen, Mr. Vance, Mr. Warner, Mr. Warnock, Ms. Warren, Mr. Welch, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden, Mr. Young.
On this vote, the yeas are 47, the nays are 51. The motion is not agreed to. The majority leader.
Stay in their seats till we complete this vote. That way we can get it done most quickly. Thank you. This is final passage.
The senator from Washington.
Thank you, Mr. President. It has been a long road, but we are about to vote on a bipartisan funding bill that the House passed overwhelmingly, and we are finally ready to close the book on FY24. This is not the legislation Democrats or Republicans would have written on our own. It is the result of tough negotiations. It is a bipartisan package that invests in families and our country's future. And I want to thank Vice Chair Collins and so many others for working with us to get this done. This was not easy, but we all know how important the investments this bill makes in our country. It matters. So I hope all of our colleagues will join us now in voting to send these bipartisan bills to the President's desk. We don't have a minute to spare. Thank you, Mr. President.
Mr. President,
The senior senator from Maine.
Mr. President, it has been a long night and a long process, but we are on the verge of clearing the final 6 appropriations bill for this fiscal year. And that's an important milestone. I want to thank Chair Murray, the members of the Appropriations Committee, and everyone who worked so constructively tonight. And I'd be remiss if I did not thank our hardworking staff. Thank you, Mr. President.
Mr. President.
The majority leader.
Mr. President, it's been a long day, a long week, a very long few months. But tonight we have funded the government with significant investments for parents and kids and small businesses and healthcare workers, military families, and so much more. It's no small feat to get a package like this done in divided government. These past few months have shown yet again that when bipartisan has room to work, we can get the job done. A deep and sincere thank you to all of my colleagues on both sides of the aisle for their good work. Thank you, Chair Murray. Thank you, Vice Chair Collins, all the appropriations and their staff, and thank you to my incredible staff too. This was not easy, but our efforts have paid off with a strong funding bill that now goes to the President. And finally, Mr. President, many of us have signed a condolence book to Senator Collins on the loss of her mother. It was even more difficult for her to get this bill done given the circumstances, but she showed her usual strength, courage, and tenacity. So I'd like to just ask for a couple of seconds of silence for Susan's mother, and I'll present this book to her.
Under the previous order, the cloture motion is withdrawn, and the motion to refer and the motion to concur with amendment number 1790 and the amendments pending thereby are withdrawn. The question occurs on the motion to concur. Yeas and nays have been requested. Is there sufficient second? There appears to be. There is. The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Baldwin. Okay. Mr. Barrasso. Mr. Bennett. Mrs. Blackburn. Mr. Blumenthal. Mr. Booker. Mr. Bozeman. Mr. Braun. Mrs. Britt. Mr. Brown. Mr. Budd. Ms. Butler. Ms. Cantwell. Mrs. Capito. Mr. Cardin. Mr. Carper. Mr. Casey. Mr. Cassidy. Ms. Collins. Mr. Coons. Mr. Cornyn. Ms. Cortez Masto. Mr. Cotton. Mr. Kramer. Mr. Crapo. Mr. Cruz. Mr. Daines. Ms. Duckworth. Mr. Durbin. Ms. Ernst. Mr. Fetterman, Mrs. Fisher. Mrs. Gillibrand. Mr. Graham. Mr. Grassley. Mr. Haggerty. Ms. Hassan. Mr. Hawley. Mr. Heinrich. Mr. Hickenlooper. Ms. Hirono. Mr. Hoven. Mrs. Hyde-Smith. Mr. Johnson. Mr. Kane. Mr. Kelly. Mr. Kennedy. Mr. King. Ms. Klobuchar. Mr. Langford. Mr. Lee. Mr. Lujan. Ms. Lummis. Mr. Manchin. Mr. Markey. Mr. Marshall. Mr. McConnell. Mr. Menendez. Mr. Merkley. Mr. Moran. Mr. Mullen. Ms. Murkowski. Mr. Murphy. Mrs. Murray. Mr. Ossoff. Mr. Padilla. Mr. Paul. Mr. Peters. Mr. Reed. Mr. Ricketts. Mr. Risch. Mr. Romney. Ms. Rosen. Mr. Rounds. Mr. Rubio. Mr. Sanders. Mr. Schatz. Mr. Schmidt. Mr. Schumer. Mr. Scott of Florida, Mr. Scott of South Carolina. Mrs. Shaheen. Ms. Sinema. Ms. Smith. Ms. Stabenow. Mr. Sullivan. Mr. Tester. Mr. Thune. Mr. Tillis. Mr. Tuberville. Mr. Van Hollen. Mr. Vance. Mr. Warner. Mr. Warnock. Ms. Warren. Mr. Welch. Mr. Whitehouse. Mr. Wicker. Mr. Wyden. Mr. Young.
On this vote, the yeas are 74, the nays are 24. Under the previous order requiring 60 votes for the adoption of this motion, the motion is agreed to.
Mr. President,
Senator from Washington.
Mr. President, there were a lot of naysayers who didn't believe that this divided Congress could pass full-year appropriation bills. Tonight, we proved them wrong. We have finally passed all 12 bills to fund the government, and I am proud to be sending a $1 billion increase in funding for childcare and pre-K to the President's desk. Mr. President, as chair of the Appropriations Committee, you have a responsibility. You helped decide in a big way how to set the nation's spending priorities. I wanted to write our bills to put working people, the parents I talk to all around my state who can't afford childcare first. I remember when I drove 100 miles to Olympia, our state capital, with my 2 young kids to try and save their preschool program. And a state lawmaker told me I couldn't make a difference. I was just a mom in tennis shoes. Well, this mom in tennis shoes is now the Senate Appropriations Chair. And Mr. President, I think it makes a difference when you have a former preschool teacher and someone who lived what it means to be a working mom with young kids holding the pen in our nation's spending bills. So I decided childcare had to be at the top of our country's priorities, and this time it was not going to get knocked off. Mr. President, I am so glad we're making this investment in our kids and our families and in our economy. But this bill delivers a lot more. President Biden will be signing a bipartisan bill that delivers on the investments that matter most in people's daily lives, on everything from Pell Grants to community health centers. And this funding, free of the devastating cuts and extreme riders that was pushed by the House Republicans that would have sent our country back decades. And Mr. President, from day one of this process, I said there would be no extreme far-right riders to restrict women's reproductive freedoms in these funding bills. Not small, not big, none. And Mr. President, there are none. Democrats stood firm to protect a woman's right to choose in these negotiations, beating back countless far-right policies from House Republicans to ban abortion and attack reproductive freedom in every way possible. Now, Mr. President, these bills came about after some tough negotiations, but they will move our country forward. And I have to once again thank my Vice Chair, Susan Collins, for her partnership. We passed 12 bills with overwhelming bipartisan support last summer, and that was important. I think that bipartisanship and shared commitment to doing what was right for the country served us well in negotiating these final spending bills. I hope my House Republican colleagues now understand that bipartisanship is the only path forward in a divided government. I hope they understand that when you strike a deal, you have to stick to it. It has to mean something. And I hope my House Republican colleagues will now continue to work with us, not against us, to deliver for the American people. Now, Mr. President, as Appropriations Chair, I'm so glad to finally close the book on this year's government funding. I am ready as ever to work with all of my colleagues as we determine what investments our country will make. Let's keep working to help people and solve problems. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor. Mr. President,
Senator from Washington.
I ask unanimous consent the Senate proceed to the immediate consideration of H-Con Res 100, which was received from the House and is at the desk.
Clerk will report.
H-Con Res 100, concurrent resolution directing the clerk of the House of Representatives to make a correction in the enrollment of H.R. 2882.
Without objection, the Senate will proceed to the measure.
Mr. President, I further ask that the concurrent resolution be agreed to and the motion to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table with no intervening action or debate.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I suggest the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Baldwin.
But all these years later, you hear the same people, the same wing of the same party making the same arguments once again, and the arguments just don't make any sense. One of the ones I think is hardest to understand is this argument that we can't simultaneously support Ukraine. We, the United States of America, cannot simultaneously support Ukraine and prepare for a possible conflict with China, which I'm sure nobody here would wish. I certainly don't wish that conflict, but it's more than hypothetical. It's possible that someday we might be in conflict. But the idea that we would stop supporting Ukraine in an actual conflict against tyranny, in an actual conflict against fascism, in the hope that we would somehow be better prepared for later, makes absolutely no sense. And then when you look at the contents of the bills themselves, the bills that we passed, Mr. President, as part of the supplemental, and you see the money that's being spent all across America in 40 states, Mr. President, in 70 cities, Mr. President. Our industrial production for our military is up 20% since Russia invaded Ukraine because we were not investing in our production before that happened. That was a threat to our national security. And we are doing it now all over this country, all over the United States, in big cities and little cities, in rural communities and urban communities. That's what we're doing. And we're retooling our defense complex. Mr. President, could you ask the folks to please give me a chance to?
The Senate will be in order if members and staff would remove their conversations from the floor.
Thank you. So if I grant the isolationist wing's view of this, what I would say is even based on your own arguments, you should be for these bills, because these bills are making the United States stronger. They're refreshing our industrial base, our military base, and they're making us more prepared, not just for what's going on in Russia today, but for what could go on in China. I mean, it's utterly self-explanatory. And that's why I think it's actually an excuse for not engaging. I think it's an isolationist impulse and tendency that we've seen before. We saw it when the United States shamefully didn't get into World War II until years after we should have, and we're seeing it again here. But this is a different case than that, because we're not talking about American troops. We're just talking about American support. So we're talking about retooling our industrial base. We're talking about creating jobs here in the United States. We're talking about spending the vast majority of money that we authorized in that bill in the United States of America, not in Ukraine, but here. And I suppose it would be one thing if Ukraine hadn't earned our support, but on top of everything else, they have. In the last 2 years since they were invaded, an invasion they did not ask for, they have done everything the world could have asked of them, more than the world could have asked of them. You know, it's another point here too, Mr. President, that we're not sending them mostly our fanciest equipment either. We're sending them older equipment that's a lot better than the Soviet age equipment that they had. But it's allowing us to have the newest versions of this. We're sending older versions of that equipment to Ukraine, but they have used it magnificently. I'm on the Intelligence Committee, and the intelligence community is telling us that the Ukrainian people have fought magnificently. I've heard some of the isolationists on the other side of the aisle say, well, we don't know where the money's being spent. and therefore we shouldn't spend any more money. There is no, I think it is safe to say, Mr. President, that there is no enterprise in the world. I choose my words carefully. There is no enterprise in the world that has a better set of receipts than the men and women that have been fighting on the Ukrainian front lines. I challenge any of those people to show me where they said that Ukraine was going to throw Putin off half the territory that he took from them, but they have. That they've been able to attack his so-called, impregnable supersonic missiles, but they have. The Ukrainian people don't even have a navy, really. I don't mean any offense, but it's true. They don't really have a navy, and yet they've been able to keep Putin out of the Black Sea. And that has meant that wheat has been able to be transported from Ukraine all over the world so people can eat. These fighters have the receipts. It's in the success that they've had. And it's important to understand this isn't just a fight for Ukraine, which they have fought magnificently. It's a fight for the West. It's a fight for NATO. It's a fight for democracy itself. They didn't ask for this fight. President Zelensky never asked for this fight. 3 years ago, he was cutting television, or he was on a television program, and then he ran for president. And he got elected because there was such concern about corruption in the country. They said, you know what, we're going to put a television guy in charge, and maybe he'll do better. And then Putin invaded his country, thinking that he was going to be able to decapitate the regime in 72 hours, thinking that Zelensky was going to run, thinking that they wouldn't stand up to his invasion. The first invasion since we settled all this stuff at the end of World War II with the global order and commitment to the rule of law. My mom's still alive, the one that my mom, who was, I mentioned earlier, born in 1938, she's still alive. She can't believe she's lived long enough to see another land war break out in Europe. I suppose, seen from a different way, it's an incredible testament to the institutions that have been built and the alliances that have been built, that it's been so long since we've had somebody who would, with the audacity to do what Putin has done. But thank God he ran into the Ukrainians for all of us, because we don't have to send our people there. And NATO does not have to send their people there. They're willing to fight and die for democracy. And they're asking us to support them, not with our people, but with our military support and with a little bit of money. Now, as I mentioned earlier, we passed a bill with 72 votes over here to fund the effort in Ukraine. And the House of Representatives has completely ignored it. That same isolationist wing that is over here, that is now over there in the House of Representatives, is declining to fulfill our responsibilities to the rest of the world. And they have left town today without having supported Ukraine. I want to say, by the way, as I stand here, that there's been an incident in Moscow today, or outside of Moscow, and I'm very sorry for the theater goers that are there who lost their lot, for their illustration of how complicated this world is. But let me tell you something, Mr. President. There is nobody more cheerful about the House of Representatives' failure to pass the Senate bill than Vladimir Putin. He reads our newspapers. He reads our social media. He manipulates our social media. And he knows what's at stake. And the Ukrainians know what's at stake. And this is not fanciful. The questions that are at risk here. Look what happened just in the last few weeks in Russia. Vladimir Putin got reelected by something over 95% of the vote in Moscow. And of course, it was completely manipulated. And he went out and said, this is an endorsement for my war. This fraudulent election is endorsement of my war. Look what happened in Hong Kong last weekend, Mr. President, where the Chinese Communist Party from Beijing has completely thrown out the rule book in Hong Kong, which has a long tradition of commitment to the rule of law, free enterprise, a place where you could predictably run a business or have a newspaper, have an opposition. And in this weekend, they've sucked out the last embers that were glowing there of the right to be able to do that stuff. So now you can get a life prison, maybe even worse than a life prison in Hong Kong if you defy what Beijing says. Just like Alexander Navalny, who was put in prison by Putin, the leading opposition figure in Russia, put in prison by Putin, and now, died of natural causes in his early 40s because Putin killed him. While members of this Congress were at Munich during the security conference, he knew exactly what the message was he was sending. I care so little about your opinion of this that I'm going to kill Alex Navalny while you are all there. So I'm going to come to an end because I can tell people need to move on to the next thing. But let me just say, Mr. President, contrary to what I've heard in the debate around here, the Ukrainians have succeeded beyond anybody's wildest dreams. The evidence is so clear that that's true. Even the most recent town that was defeated, which was a smoldering ruin by the time the Russians got there, Avdiivka, it took the Russians 6 months and 30,000 troops to get that village. And the lines have held otherwise, notwithstanding the fact that they're out of bullets, notwithstanding the fact that they're out of artillery. And that at this point, in some ways, they're kind of fighting with their bare hands, which is how they started in this war. And we have a responsibility here that is not a service to Ukraine. This is a service to our national security. This is a service to our kids and to our grandkids. This is a service that's the same as the one that was provided by the people before World War II who were able to overcome the America First crowd back then so that America could play its unique role in the world. And this is a service to anybody on planet Earth who cares about freedom, who cares about the ability to have a real debate and a real discussion, who cares about whether there's actually a rule of law in place so might doesn't make right, so that you can open a small business in your village on a corner and know that a gang isn't going to come and steal your money, so that you know that your parents and grandparents aren't going to be locked up with the key thrown away just because they had a different point of view than the ruler of the country. And in human history, it's much more common to see a situation where might makes right than it is for people to exercise those freedoms. And the Ukrainians know that from the guys that are on the front lines to President Zelensky and back. That's why they're fighting so hard for this freedom. That's why we need to pay attention when Putin takes out his leading opposition. That's why we need to understand the implications for us when China sweeps into Hong Kong and rips away people's freedoms and people's rights in front of the entire world. It's what happens when they shut down opposition newspapers. This is something we should be able to agree on without respect to our political party. And I worry a lot about what's going to happen over the next 2 weeks, because there are people out there that are not telling the truth about what the battle has been in Ukraine. There are people out there, amazingly to me, who think the United States can't support Ukraine effectively and prepare for what might be coming down the pike. There are people who don't believe that our military needs to be retooled. And I'm really worried in this moment that crossing our fingers and hoping for the best is not a recipe for a good outcome here. And that's why I believe that it was critical for us to try to force in this debate on this bill the inclusion of Ukraine funding. And I've said that all the way along. The first funding bill that came over here 6 months ago, I threatened to shut the government down over that bill because it didn't include Ukraine funding. A deal had been cut behind closed doors between the then Speaker in the House and others in the House to allow the bill to come forward without Ukraine funding. And I said to my colleagues here, we have no plan to fund Ukraine. We had no plan to fund Ukraine. And as a result of that threat, we were able to get commitments from the leaders of the Democratic Party and the Republican Party here that we keep working on it, and we keep working on it. Several months later, we had the same kind of moment, and we were able to get the same kind of commitment. And because we all work together on this, notwithstanding the political divisions that exist in our country, we were able to get to that 72-person vote. We were able to show Putin that we were going to stand up against him here. And unlike some people here, he knows exactly how things are going on the Ukrainian battlefield. He knows he's got real problems on the Ukrainian battlefield because it took 30,000 people to succeed at the last village that he was able to secure. And he knows how this nation of MacGyvers has shown up time and time and time again to figure out how to take him on with their fists or with drones or with our help. But I'm sorry to say this, Mr. President, I think it is true that the battlefield that he is trying to succeed on is the battlefield of the United States Congress. He thinks he is going to win on this battlefield. He's trying to count on our dysfunction, our division, our petty disagreements, and the lack of understanding about what's at stake here from a historical point of view or from democracy's point of view, or the message that we want to send to our allies and to our foes around the world. Tonight, he's going to be able to sleep a little better because the House failed to do it. So I'm not here to say that I'm going to shut the government down. There's nothing I can do at this point to bring the House of Representatives back to Washington, D.C. That's not possible. There wouldn't be any benefit to doing it. I am going to vote against this bill because it doesn't include the Ukraine funding in it. And I would say to my colleagues who are here, every single one of whom supported the Ukraine funding when it came through the Senate, that we've got our work cut out for us over the next 2 weeks to make sure that we persuade the people in the House of Representatives that there's no more time left. That the Ukrainians, as I said, are out of bullets and out of ammo and out of time. And we're out of time too. The whole world is watching us. I don't know the speaker, but I'd be very surprised if he wants to go down in history as the person or the politician who lost Ukraine. Who lost Ukraine because he had to hold on to his job, or who lost Ukraine because there were people in his party who couldn't resist the celebrity benefit of going out and raising money on a crazy politics that doesn't recognize the stakes for what they are. We were able to close over that here in the Senate. And I believe that the House is going to have to do that as well. And we've got to do everything we can to make sure they reach that conclusion, because the consequence for our nation's reputation will be as severe as anything that we have ever certainly faced in the last decades around here. So usually I would end by saying I'm confident. What I'm confident is that there are people of goodwill in this body that have worked together to get this done, and who will continue to work together to make sure the United States of America stands up for democracy, stands up for NATO, stands up for our responsibilities to our children and grandchildren, and our responsibilities to this world. With that, Mr. President, I yield the floor.
Mr. President,
Majority Whip.
before he leaves the floor, I want to thank my colleague from Colorado. He has been steadfast in his support of the Ukrainian effort, and it makes a difference. I think we all have to speak out with what we're facing. We should have appropriated the money long ago to stand behind the people of Ukraine. And the fact that they are now at a moment in history where their fate may be decided really underlines the importance of your statement to this Senate. Though this bill that's going to be voted on later this evening covers so many areas, it still leaves a terrible gap, not only in our support for Ukraine, but also for the humanitarian assistance, which was part of our effort. When we read of the terrible humanitarian tragedy in Gaza and other places, we realize the United States needs to help provide water and food and medicine and the basics for them to survive, just as we need to help the people in Ukraine to fight this effort. Let me just add parenthetically a moment of personal pride. 60 Minutes in a show last week highlighted Lithuania in the Baltics and how this small country of 3 million people has become a haven for political dissidents from Russia and other places. It is with some risk that they've assumed this responsibility, but they are part of a commitment, this small nation, to democracy. The United States needs to make that same commitment and put our money where our values really lie. Your speech this evening highlighted that, and I thank you for your leadership.
Senator from Washington.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent the following staffer in my office be granted floor privileges for the remainder of the 118th Congress. Emily Trudeau.
Without it.
Mr. President,
Majority Leader.
I ask unanimous are we in quorum?
We're not.
No. I ask unanimous consent that at 6:15, the Senate proceed to executive session to resume consideration of the Scheidlower nomination and vote on the confirmation of the nomination without further intervening action or debate, and with all of the previous provisions remaining in effect.
Without objection.
I yield the floor. Note the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Baldwin.
Mr. President.
Senator from Wisconsin.
Mr. President, over the last several days and weeks, I've heard a lot
Senate's
of
in a quorum call.
Oh, I ask that the quorum call be vitiated.
Without objection.
Mr. President, over the last several days and weeks, I've heard a lot of discussion from some of my colleagues here in the Senate and in the House of Representatives about what they consider to be inappropriate congressionally directed spending projects. The majority of those projects appear to be objectionable simply because the organization involved provides services to lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender Americans. Let me say that all of the CDS projects identified in the Labor, Health and Human Services and Education bill were in the Senate bill that was reported out of the Appropriations Committee last summer by an overwhelming bipartisan vote of 26-2. Second, and more importantly, I am deeply concerned about why these projects are being singled out. They're being singled out and discriminated against because they serve a particular group of Americans, a group of Americans that every single one of us in this chamber represents. We all have gay and lesbian, bisexual, and transgender constituents. And just like any other group of constituents, they are deserving of getting health care, mental health care, affordable housing, and a little help to lead a successful life. However, the bullying campaign against organizations that help people who are just living their true, authentic lives is just wrong. For example, one project singled out provides services for LGBTQ seniors as a part of a housing project. The project is to help low-income seniors age in place. The Labor HHS education bill includes multiple CDS projects that help our seniors get the care and housing they need as they age. But this is the only one that's been on a list as being somehow objectionable. Another is a federally qualified community health center, basically one of our community health centers that provides services for individuals struggling with substance use disorder. That organization has noticed an increased need among members of the LGBTQ community and noted in their CDS request that that's a population that they served and who needs service. For this, the CDS project was, again, by some of my colleagues, identified as somehow controversial. In fact, several of the projects that have been identified as problematic are to provide mental health services to people in the LGBTQ community, including LGBTQ youth. LGBTQ kids are just like any other kids. They have stressors in life. They face depression, anxiety, and other challenges, and they need help navigating it. Now, some of this criticism has been blatant misinformation, including one in my own home state. An organization in Wisconsin that has for a long period of time helped kids who experience homelessness get help to get back on their feet with employment help or mental health and counseling, finding housing, and more. I was proud to secure funding for a very specific and narrow program of theirs that provides mental health support and counseling for kids experiencing homelessness. This would be for all kids. In fact, the organization does such great work that it's received federal funding for years, including under the Trump administration. But since the organization has a program which will get exactly $0 of this federal funding, but this program to help LGBTQ kids, it was ruthlessly attacked and smeared. These attacks do not live in a vacuum, and they have real-world consequences. When this body says to LGBTQ community members that they are not worthy of our help, what kind of message do you think that sends? Also, considering that we agree that the country is facing a mental health crisis, why would we be barring resources from helping a certain group of people, particularly a group that is acutely feeling the mental health crisis? A recent survey of LGBTQ youth revealed that nearly half of LGBTQ youth seriously consider attempting suicide in this past year. Nearly 1 in 4 LGBTQ youth attempted suicide, and nearly 3 in 4 reported persistent feelings of sadness and hopelessness. But almost 60% of LGBTQ youth who wanted mental health care in the past year were not able to access it. These statistics are all young people, someone's child, sibling, neighbor, student, or classmate, and maybe one or more will occupy these seats working collaboratively with colleagues to serve their state and their country. I hope we can pause to consider that when we single out a group of Americans, it has a real impact. Our work and our words here matter. And I hope we can rise above the bullying, and we can, as we have for months, work across the aisle to deliver for all of our constituents. I yield back.
Mr. President.
Senator from West Virginia.
Mr. President, I rise today in support of amendment number 1725, which will be called up later. Incentivize people to buy an EV if we were making and sourcing these ingredients that we needed, the critical minerals from America, or a reliable supply chains. And that supply chain was countries that we already had free trade agreements with. And let me make sure you understand. Our main objective for this bill, the IRA, was this: we will not be doing business with foreign countries of concern. And those foreign countries were four mainly: China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea. There's no way we should be depending on anything coming from them who doesn't have our values, because they will use it as a wedge. But the administration has completely liberalized and, in fact, broken the law that we agreed to and actually passed. And we've been having this continuously back and forth. I cannot believe, dealing in good faith, we ended up with what we ended up with. We put strict but achievable standards in the IRA to ensure that China and other nations that don't share our values don't benefit off the backs of the American taxpayers, and that we don't willingly give Xi Jinping, president of China, a geopolitical weapon to use against us. I can guarantee you, when he watched Putin weaponize energy, he surely was going to basically use it, the weaponization of all the critical minerals that we're using and all the things that we depend on from China. He'd have done the same thing with. I remember waiting in line in gas lines in 1974 to have to buy gasoline to go to work. I can remember those days vividly. I couldn't believe it. The United States of America got itself into that mess. But we did. But we got ourselves out of it too. And you think that China's not going to be using that to their advantage to bring us to our knees? Well, I'm not going to be waiting in line for a battery to come from China, sir. Sorry. But last year, the administration proposed cutting in half the IRA's requirements. This is how desperate they are to get more, to basically disregard the bill that we all agreed on in good faith and signed with the purpose of bringing manufacturing back. But they want their ambition to get more EVs out the door quicker than ever before. They cut everything in half. This is exactly what's written in the bill. This is it, language plain. By 2023, you should have had 40% of the minerals that must be extracted or processed in the U.S. for free trade agreement countries or recycled in North America. 40%. Every year it went up. So we would be more and more dependent on America, building up and building basically our ability to manufacture. This is exactly what they did. Do you think it's a coincidence they cut everything in half? From 40%. Now, this is what they admitted. This is what they're working with. This is their, they call them their new rules they have coming out, according to the Treasurer's proposed rules. I'll get into why they call them proposed rules too. So this is what we intended to be self-sufficient. This is exactly what they intended to meet their political agenda to get these out the door quicker, cut everything in half. The IRA set deadlines. And like I said before, the deadlines were 2023, 24 to completely remove the countries from the critical minerals and battery manufacturing. We wrote language in the bill. If you read the IRA bill, it's written in there that we cannot do business with China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea. That was the whole purpose. If you're going to go down this path, let's make sure we get something back for the American taxpayers, but also for American manufacturing. But now the IRS is proposing temporary exemptions through at least the end of 2026. When have you heard of temporary rules that would go through? They're supposed to be basically done by December 31st, 2024. They put in their rules 2026 or later. Or later. There's another 3 years of China and other foreign nations reaching deeper into and controlling more of our electric vehicles' battery supply chain. The longer we allow this to happen, the longer we allow this to happen by basically not being more pushing our American energy and technologies quicker, then basically all we're doing is supporting China and their grip they have on us. Worse yet, the IRS under this administration seems to have adopted a new legal strategy to avoid any accountability from the courts or Congress. Now, this is the real innovative, creative way they're thinking. By issuing proposed rules, when you issue proposed rules like this and never finalizing them, the IRS can break the law, legally break the law, implement it in any way they wish, that they would have passed it. I have said this from day one. You're implementing a piece of legislation you never passed. I tell the White House that every day. You didn't pass this. The law we passed tells you exactly what to do. You're trying to implement something that you would like to do, but you never did. And they do it with proposed rules because they think that basically protects them from any litigation. It's a breach of everything that we agreed, a breach of everything that we agreed in good faith, and not the way the government in this great country of ours should ever operate. Let me be clear. There's no question that the IRA will be one of the most transformative bills in the way it was written. It was all of the above. It was an all-purpose bill. It was balanced between the energy that we need today, the fossil fuels that we're going to do them cleaner, and the technology of the energy we want in the future. That's exactly what the bill was proposed to do. It was proposed to bring back manufacturing that we let go, basically with the NAFTA agreement, North American Free Trade Agreement way back when in the 80s and 90s, and then now with what we're dealing with bringing China in the WTO in late 90s, early 2000s. We've allowed things to leave our country we should have never allowed the manufacturing base to ever leave. So let me be clear. There's no question that the IRA will go down as one of the most transformational bill that we've ever passed. It's bringing opportunity. It surely is. It's bringing opportunity in areas that got left behind. Electric vehicle and battery makers announced $52 billion in investments in North America supply chains before the IRS even started loosening the rules. They want to come back to America. They want to build. But as long as you basically allow the foreign entities of concerns, the Chinas of the world, to continue to flood the market with cheaper prices, our people will never be able to have a foothold as far as in manufacturing in the United States. That's the problem. We knew it would take a couple years for us to get up to speed, but we'll never get up to speed as long as they can still buy cheaper products somewhere else. Numbers like this show that breaking the law doesn't get us more investment. It just makes the cost go up for every American taxpayer and sends our tax dollars overseas. We're trying to bring that manufacturing back and keep those dollars here, not in China or Russia. But even bribing Americans with liberalized and lawful $7,500 wasn't good enough for the administration because it doesn't meet their political timetable to eliminate gas-powered vehicles. Now, if they had a good enough product, the product in America, the market usually will react. The market will reject or accept. It won't do it on your timetable. But when you have the government behind you, pushing you in a way to force the options you may have, that's not how we built the country we have. It's not how we built this capitalist mentality or this and entrepreneurship. It's just not who we are. So the EPA piled on by proposing these new tailpipe rules that force automakers to limit consumer choice and force Americans to buy EVs full of Chinese parts. It's exactly what's happening now. EPA wants more than 2/3 of the new cars to be electric by 2032, when there's only 8% of them are electric today. They can't meet that goal unless it's buying overseas, which is what we try to stop. Their intentions is continue to flood the market any way they possibly can for their own political agenda by their extreme environmental and climates at the destruction basically of our own jobs, our own economy. The only way it would be possible to get anywhere close, like I said before, is to do business with other foreign countries because China has a lock on most of all the markets. Anodes, cathodes, 80% of that. Basically, rare earth minerals, about 60 to 80% of that. They've been doing this for quite a while. We want to get back up to speed, but we can't do it by continuing to support them. Xi Jinping is already showing that he will use critical minerals as leverage to put Americans and the free world at risk by directing the Chinese government to implement new restrictions on exports of several critical minerals. Now he'll really start putting the choke on us. He sees that we have legislation that's going to force us to buy a product that he has control over. Can you imagine us getting ourselves into a jam to where we're going to be dependent upon China for the critical minerals and the battery components that we need to run the vehicles that we decided to change our transportation mode to before we're ready to do it ourselves? I'd expect that from Xi Jinping and the Chinese Communist Party, but I can't believe that we'd be dumb enough to play into their hands. It's unbelievable. And there's nobody that you can talk to in the industry doesn't understand exactly what I'm saying. I never could have expected our own government to give up so easily and continue to let foreign nations control our nation's transportation. You know, I even said this too. They told me about all the charging stations that we have to spend billions and billions of dollars. The federal government, federal taxpayers. I do not remember when Henry Ford basically was able to have the production of the Model T and bring it into mass production where the average person could buy it, that we said, oh, we got to go out and start building filling stations. I don't think the federal government built filling stations to meet the demand of the market. The market did it, and the market will do it again. Oh, no, we can't do that. We can't take a chance on the market. So let's go ahead and just commit billions and billions of dollars of taxpayers' money to do what the market has always done for America. I'll do everything in my power to hold this administration accountable to the deal we made and the intent of the deal. Everybody knew about it. Protect America's taxpayers and to secure our energy supply chains. If we're going to do it, let's do it and benefit from it. Let's build America back. Let's do what we do best. Let's innovate and create. Let's believe in the market and allow the market basically force us to work as they've always worked for America. I urge my colleagues to support this amendment that's coming up because I can tell you one thing. We have got to send a signal that this country is able to take care of itself. We're able to compete for ourselves, and we should not depend on foreign, unreliable foreign supply chains for the most critical building blocks of our country. Transportation basically keeps the lights on, it keeps food on your table, it does everything necessary for us to live a quality of life in this country. And to allow it and give it up because we are not in control of our transportation mode is absolutely criminal. So with that, Mr. President, I would say I hope all of our colleagues will look at this amendment very seriously and see how important it is for us to maintain this tremendous independence this country has always had. And with that, I yield the floor.
Question occurs on the confirmation. Is there a sufficient second? Clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Baldwin, Mr. Barrasso, Mr. Bennett, Mrs. Blackburn, Mr. Blumenthal, Mr. Booker, Mr. Bozeman, Mr. Braun, Mrs. Britt, Mr. Brown, Mr. Budd, Ms. Butler, Ms. Cantwell, Mrs. Capito, Mr. Carden, Mr. Carper, Mr. Casey, Mr. Cassidy, Ms. Collins, Mr. Coons, Mr. Cornyn, Ms. Cortez Masto, Mr. Cotton, Mr. Kramer, Mr. Crapo, Mr. Cruz, Mr. Daines, Ms. Duckworth, Mr. Durbin, Ms. Ernst, Mr. Fetterman, Mrs. Fisher, Mrs. Gillibrand, Mr. Graham, Mr. Grassley, Mr. Haggerty. Did he vote? No, I knew I need him. I need you to vote. I need. Mr. Grassley, Mr. Haggerty, Ms. Hassan, Mr. Hawley. Never mind, I got somebody.
Okay.
I'm all set. Mr. Hawley, Mr. Heinrich, Mr. Hickenlooper, Mrs. Hirono, Mr. Hoven, Mrs. Hyde-Smith, Mr. Johnson, Mr. Kane, Mr. Kelly, Mr. Kennedy, Mr. King, Ms. Klobuchar, Mr. Langford, Mr. Lee, Mr. Lujan, Ms. Lummis, Mr. Manchin, Mr. Markey, Mr. Marshall, Mr. McConnell, Mr. Menendez, Mr. Merkley, Mr. Moran, Mr. Mullen, thank you, Ms. Murkowski, Mr. Murphy, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Ossoff, Mr. Padilla, Mr. Paul, Mr. Peters, Mr. Reed, Mr. Ricketts, Mr. Risch, Mr. Romney, Ms. Rosen, Mr. Rounds, Mr. Rubio, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schmidt, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott of Florida, Mr. Scott of South Carolina, Mrs. Shaheen, Ms. Sinema, Ms. Smith, Ms. Stabenow, Mr. Sullivan, Mr. Tester, Mr. Thune, Mr. Tillis, Mr. Tuberville, Mr. Van Hollen, Mr. Vance, Mr. Warner, Mr. Warnock, Ms. Warren, Mr. Welch, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden, Mr. Young. Senators voting in the affirmative Baldwin, Cassidy, Cornyn, Crapo, Daines, Duckworth, Graham, Grassley, Hassan, Heinrich, Manchin, Merkley, Ossoff, Reed, Ricketts, Schatz, Cinema, Thune, and Tillis. Mr. Tuberville voted in the negative. Ms. Collins? Aye. Mr. Whitehouse, aye. Mr. Casey? Aye. Mr. Rubio, aye. Mr. Rounds, aye. Ms. Smith, aye. Mrs. Murray, aye. Mr. Wyden, aye. Mr. Barrasso, aye. Mrs. Capito, aye. Mr. Johnson, aye. Mr. Vance, no. Mr. Warnock, aye. Mr. Kramer, aye. Mrs. Shaheen, aye. Mr. Brown, aye. Ms. Butler, aye. Mr. Mullen, aye. Mr. Lujan, aye. Ms. Warren, aye. Mr. Van Hollen, aye. Mr. Lee, aye. Mr. Tester, aye. Mr. Langford, aye. Mr. Schmidt, no. Mr. Carper, aye. Ms. Rosen, aye. Mr. Wicker, aye. Ms. Murkowski, aye. Mr. Paul, no. Mr. Sullivan, no. Mr. King, aye. Mr. Cruz, aye. Mr. Schumer, aye. Mr. Marshall, no. Mr. Cardin, aye. Ms. Cortez Masto, aye. Mr. Durbin, aye. Mr. Booker, aye. Ms. Ernst, aye. Mr. Kennedy, aye. Mr. Moran. Aye. Mrs. Britt, no. You weren't ready. Aye. Mr. Rish, aye. Mr. Markey, aye. Mr. Cotton, aye. Mrs. Fisher, aye. Mr. Welch, aye. Ms. Cantwell, aye. Mr. Romney, aye. Mr. Padilla, aye. Ms. Stabenow, aye. Mrs. Blackburn, aye. Mrs. Hyde Smith, aye. Mr. McConnell, aye. Mr. Sanders, aye. Ms. Hirono, aye. Mr. Peters, aye. Mr. Coons, aye. Mr. Murphy, aye. Mr. Budd, aye. Mr. Bozeman, aye. Mr. Hickenlooper, aye. Mr. Menendez, aye. Ms. Klobuchar, aye. Mr. Bennett, aye. Mr. Hoven, aye. Mr. Scott of South Carolina, aye. Mr. Hawley, no. Mr. Young, aye. Ms. Lummis, aye. Mr. Kelly. Aye. Mr. Blumenthal. Aye. Mrs. Gillibrand, aye. Mr. Kane, aye. Mr. Warner, aye.
Mr. Fetterman, aye.